There's a number that British cities are not designed to handle, not comfortably, not safely, not without consequences that ripple through transport networks, hospitals, homes, water systems, and the lives of millions of people who have never had to think about heat as a serious threat before. That number is 30 degrees Celsius. And right now, forecasters are watching the atmospheric setup above the UK with growing certainty that this number is coming, not as a distant seasonal possibility, but as an imminent, near-term reality. The question being asked in weather centers, council offices, NHS trusts, and infrastructure control rooms across the country is not whether the heat will arrive. The question is whether anything has actually changed since the last time it arrived and broke things. The uncomfortable answer, according to researchers, engineers, and public health experts who have spent years studying exactly this problem, is largely no. Britain is weeks away from its first 30-degree heat wave of 2026, according to forecasters tracking a developing atmospheric pattern that could push temperatures to levels last seen during the record-breaking events of recent summers. The Met Office's 3-month outlook has already flagged a 40% probability of a hot summer, double the normal odds for the season. Independent forecasters at British weather services have described the potential for temperatures to climb into the high 20s and beyond by July and August, and some modeling runs already show peaks approaching or touching 30 degrees as early as late May or June if a continental heat plume establishes itself over the country. Jim Dale, meteorologist for British Weather Services, stated clearly that if a heat wave develops over Spain and the continent, all it would take is a push northward for the UK to tap into very high temperatures. That push, he said, is entirely possible. The 2026 summer, the Met Office has warned separately, is likely to be among the warmest on record globally, with temperatures expected to sit 0.5 to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 average across the UK. The atmospheric mechanism behind these events is well understood. When a high-pressure system extends northward from the Azores or Iberia and combines with warm continental air sitting over France and Spain, Britain finds itself directly in the path of a warm air pipeline that has been building heat across thousands of miles of sun-baked land before it reaches the English coast. The warmer the continent, the warmer the air arriving in Britain, and the continent is running hotter than it ever has. In the summer of 2025, Lisbon recorded a temperature of 46.6 degrees Celsius, the highest ever recorded in that city. France, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula have all pushed their national temperature records in the last 5 years. When that superheated continental air mass surges north, the UK does not simply experience a warm day. It experiences a heat event calibrated to a baseline that no longer resembles anything its infrastructure was built to withstand. The infrastructure problem is real, documented, and not adequately fixed. Roughly 20% of existing UK infrastructure is already at risk of overheating, according to expert assessments. That figure was calculated before the successive record-breaking summers of 2023, 2024, and 2025 had fully revealed the extent of the vulnerability. Britain's cities, its railway network, its road surfaces, its water pipes, its public buildings, and most critically, its housing stock, were all designed and built during a period when 30-degree days in England were rare enough to be effectively ignored in engineering specifications. The country was built for cold and damp. It was optimized for retaining heat in winter, and that optimization is now a liability every summer. The railways are perhaps the most visibly dramatic example of this mismatch. Steel tracks across the UK contain thousands of miles of material, with a thermal conductivity that causes it to absorb and transfer heat far faster than surrounding surfaces. When air temperatures reach 30 degrees Celsius, rail surface temperatures can climb to 50 or even 60 degrees Celsius, particularly in deep cuttings, sun traps, and stretches with timber rather than concrete sleepers. At those temperatures, the risk of buckling, where a section of rail expands beyond the tolerance of its fixings and deforms laterally, becomes a direct safety threat. Network Rail's response to this risk is to impose speed restrictions across large portions of the network, and those restrictions compound through the day into delays and sea cancellations that can stretch journey times by hours. During the June 2025 heat wave, speed restrictions were imposed simultaneously on the Brighton Main Line and the Western Main Line out of London Paddington, with track temperatures nearing 60 degrees. Network Rail confirmed that trains were heating up to that level at the hottest points on the network. Network Rail's route director has previously acknowledged publicly that the railway in this country is simply not engineered to run normally in such extreme temperatures. That statement has not been accompanied by the kind of investment that would change it. Network Rail has painted sections of rail white to reduce heat absorption, a measure it estimates can lower track temperature by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. That intervention helps at the margins. It does not change the fundamental engineering reality that a 19th century railway network expanded through the 20th century was not designed for 21st century climate conditions. The overhead power lines supplying electric trains also have a thermal vulnerability. Older fixed tension systems sag in high heat and force slower train speeds to prevent pantograph damage. Modern auto tension systems are less affected, but the UK's network contains a mixture of old and new, and the older sections are disproportionately concentrated on heavily used commuter routes serving major cities. When the heat arrives, the commuters who most depend on reliable services are the ones most likely to be stranded. Below the streets, the water network faces its own version of this crisis. Water pipes do not only burst in winter when household consumption surges during a heat wave, water pressure in underground pipes rises sharply. Simultaneously, the soil surrounding those pipes dries out and contracts, allowing pipes to shift at their joints, bends, and connectors. Sections of pipe that were held in place by damp, compacted earth suddenly have room to move. Exposed sections of pipe face direct solar radiation and UV damage. Poorly maintained pipes, of which there are substantial numbers in the UK's aging water infrastructure, fail under this combination of high pressure, thermal stress, and ground movement. Water company leakage rates are already a scandal in Britain in normal conditions. In a sustained 30-degree heat wave following a dry spring, the pressure on the distribution network becomes extraordinary. And this is arriving against a backdrop where reservoir and groundwater levels in parts of England are already below seasonal norms entering spring 2026, a legacy of the severe drought that depleted the country's water stores during 2025. The roads are not immune either. Tarmac has a melting threshold, and while British road surfaces are generally engineered above the temperatures seen in normal summers, extreme heat causes them to soften, deform under heavy vehicle loads, and develop ruts and surface failures that create hazards and require emergency repair. The cost of road maintenance after heat events runs into hundreds of millions of pounds across the country. The Office for Budgetary Responsibility has modeled the long-term fiscal cost of heatwave damage to UK public infrastructure and assets, and the figures are stark. In a scenario where global temperatures are held below 2 degrees Celsius warming, total potential direct fiscal costs to the UK from heat waves over the next 50 years are estimated at £49 billion. In a 3-degree warming scenario, that figure rises to £64 billion. These are not apocalyptic projections. They are actuarial assessments of damage that is already beginning to accumulate. But the most significant vulnerability when 30-degree heat arrives in a British city is not the tracks, not the pipes, not the road surfaces. It is the buildings. And above all, it is the homes. The United Kingdom has approximately 30 million dwellings. The overwhelming majority of them were designed and built with one thermal priority: keeping the cold out. They have a heavy insulation in loft spaces to stop heat escaping in winter. They have double-glazed windows that retain warmth. They have solid walls, enclosed layouts, and limited cross-ventilation. All of these features, which make a British home comfortable in November, turn it into a heat trap in August. Researchers at Loughborough University found that around 20% of UK homes already overheat during an average summer before any extreme heat event occurs. During heat waves, that proportion rises dramatically. Data gathered through the Hot Homes project in London, which fitted temperature sensors in 40 homes in the borough of Southwark, found that every single one of the monitored properties exceeded the World Health Organization's recommended maximum indoor temperature of 25 degrees Celsius during the monitoring period. During a mild heat wave in early September 2023, 85% of participating homes saw indoor temperatures above 27 degrees. 10 of the homes recorded indoor temperatures above 30 degrees. One household experienced a sustained heat period with no temperature break for 22 consecutive days, with the average indoor temperature sitting at 27 degrees throughout. And that was not even an especially hot summer. Air conditioning could solve this problem, but Britain barely has any. Only around 5% of British households have any form of air conditioning unit. In comparison, most Southern European and North American households with equivalent income levels have near universal AC coverage. The reasons for this gap are multiple. The UK climate made AC seem unnecessary for most of its housing history. The purchase and installation cost is significant. Energy costs in Britain are high relative to many comparator countries, and the planning and building policy framework has actively discouraged air conditioning for residential buildings, with the London Plan explicitly describing the spread of active cooling measures as undesirable due to their energy requirements and their contribution to the urban heat island effect. That position, which made reasonable sense when it was drafted in a cooler climate, is now being challenged as increasingly untenable. A London Assembly Committee hearing in March 2026 was told directly that the cooling hierarchy embedded in planning guidance, which treats air conditioning as a last resort, had become unhelpful given the trajectory of summer temperatures. The urban heat island effect, which that planning guidance was trying to avoid worsening, is itself a major amplifier of heat risk in British cities. Cities absorb and retain heat differently from the surrounding countryside. Concrete, tarmac, brick, and glass absorb solar radiation during the day and release it, slowly at night, preventing the temperature relief that rural areas experience after dark. In London, this effect can elevate urban temperatures by up to 10 degrees Celsius compared with suburban or rural surroundings. A city that records a peak daytime temperature of 30 degrees in an official weather measurement, typically taken at a standard meteorological station away from urban surfaces, may actually be experiencing 35 to 38 degrees at pavement level in dense inner-city areas. The heat that vulnerable residents in tower blocks, basement flats, and poorly ventilated terraced houses actually experience is significantly higher than the headline temperature on the forecast. Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, and Newcastle face versions of the same problem as London, scaled to their own densities and housing stocks. Cities with larger proportions of Victorian and Edwardian terraced housing are particularly exposed because that era of construction produced buildings with minimal ventilation, north-facing rooms that receive little natural light, and materials that absorb and retain heat effectively. Purpose-built flats, particularly those constructed after 1990 with highly insulated envelopes designed to achieve good energy performance ratings, are often the worst performers thermally during summer because their insulation works equally hard to trap heat as it does to retain warmth. The same flat that saves energy in winter becomes a box of trapped heat in summer. Renters, who make up a large and growing share of city populations and who have no authority to modify their homes, are disproportionately concentrated in exactly these property types. They cannot install external shading. They cannot upgrade ventilation. They are locked into buildings that are failing thermally by a housing market that has not yet been required to treat summer overheating as a material defect. The public health dimension of a 30-degree urban heat wave is not abstract. It has been measured, documented, and attributed to specific temperatures in specific postcodes. In the summer of 2025, London reached 34.7 degrees Celsius during the late June heat wave, and researchers estimated that around 260 excess heat-related deaths occurred in the capital during that event alone. The total heat-associated death toll for England across the 2022 summer was estimated at 2,185 people. Without climate change, mitigation, or adaptation measures, projections show that heat-related deaths in the UK could increase nearly sixfold by the 2050s, rising from approximately 1,600 deaths per year in the 2007 to 2018 baseline period to nearly 11,000 deaths annually. Heat deaths are increasing by roughly 3% for every additional degree Celsius of warming. These are not deaths from dramatic acute events. Most of them occur quietly, in hot bedrooms and overheated flats, among elderly people, people with cardiovascular and respiratory conditions, people with diabetes, and people whose medications affect their body's ability to regulate temperature. Hay die in homes that should be shelters and have become hazards. The NHS is the institution that absorbs the visible consequences of this failure. Emergency department attendance rises sharply during heat events. Ambulance call volumes spike. Hospital admissions increase for heat-related illness, for cardiovascular events triggered by the physiological stress of sustained high temperatures, and for respiratory conditions exacerbated by poor sleep in overheated homes. During the peak of the 2022 heat wave in London, cooling systems failed at data centers supporting the capital's largest NHS trust, forcing critical hospitals to abandon digital systems and revert to paper records, disrupting patient care during the period when the health service was already under maximum strain from the heat. A policy review by researchers at the Grantham Research Institute found that the NHS has yet to embed heat planning into routine operational procedures, leaving high-risk populations in hospitals, care homes, and other institutional settings more exposed than they should be. The review described the NHS response to heat waves as reactive rather than systematic, relying on alert systems that reach less than a third of the population who most need to act on them. What makes the 30-degree threshold particularly significant is that it represents the point where multiple systems fail simultaneously rather than sequentially. Below 28 degrees, transport disruption is inconvenient. Above 30, it becomes severe. Below 28, overheated homes are uncomfortable. Above 30, they become acutely dangerous for those without cooling. Below 28, hospital pressures are elevated. Above 30, they become critical. The convergence of failures at the same moment affecting the same population in the same cities is what turns a hot day into a systemic emergency. It happened in July 2022. It happened again, in a less extreme form, during the June 2025 London heatwave. And it will happen again with greater frequency as the baseline temperature continues to rise and each successive summer starts from a higher floor. The question the title of this piece asks, "Is your city ready?" deserves a direct answer based on the evidence available. London has begun drafting a heat risk delivery plan and is exploring cool spaces, water refill points, and urban greening as mitigation strategies. These are genuine steps, but they are incremental interventions layered on top of a built environment that is structurally misaligned with the climate it now occupies. The building regulations governing overheating in new homes, consolidated under Part O of England's National Building Regulations, apply only to new residential construction. They do not touch the existing housing stock, which will constitute around 80% of Britain's homes in 2050, according to projections. Energy efficiency funding streams that could theoretically support heat adaptation consistently exclude overheating as a qualifying condition, leaving landlords without financial incentive to modify properties they are already profiting from. Renters and low-income residents, who have the least capacity to adapt independently, receive the least institutional support. The Climate Change Committee, which advises the UK government on meeting its statutory climate commitments, noted in its 2025 assessment of adaptation progress that there is a significant evidence gap on overheating in buildings, data on how overheating is changing over time, and on what cooling measures are actually being installed is not being systematically collected. You cannot manage a risk you are not measuring. And Britain, for all its sophistication in weather forecasting, has built surprisingly little capacity to track what is actually happening inside the buildings where its most vulnerable citizens are trying to survive the summer. None of this means the 30-degree heat wave heading for Britain will produce a disaster. Most people will cope. Most infrastructure will hold. Most homes will be uncomfortable rather than lethal. The barbecues will still happen. The parks will fill up. The ice cream shops will sell out before noon. That is the real picture of a British heat wave for the majority of the population, and it should not be dismissed or minimized. But underneath that majority experience is a significant minority. Elderly, ill, poor, poorly housed, without air conditioning and without anyone checking on them, for whom the same event is a medical emergency. And beneath both groups is an infrastructure system that works in thin margins during extreme heat and whose failure cascades unpredictably once those margins are breached. The 30-degree forecast is not a reason to panic. It is a reason to ask, with serious urgency, why the country with the resources, the engineering expertise, the public health institutions, and the advance warning to prepare for this moment has consistently chosen not to. The heat is arriving. The question of whether the city is ready has already been answered, and the answer is not yes.